Hello, my dear friends. This is Ruslan Belov speaking, and this is the daily analysis of the Ukrainian front lines and ongoing hostilities. So Putin yesterday gave his response to Trump's actions. He stated that attempts are being made to pressure Russia. But, as he put it, no self-respecting country ever bends under pressure, and therefore Russia will not bend either. He also said that if Tomahawk missiles are launched at Russia, the response will be staggering. Trump also made a statement saying that the United States is preparing to carry out a ground operation in Venezuela in the near future. So the battles continue, and we continue our analysis of the situation. Friends, the past 24 hours were extremely eventful on the front. There have been advances on several sectors, so let's go through them one by one. But I want to start with a few comments about the Dobropilya salient. Ukrainian media and military sources, almost in unison yesterday and the day before, began spreading claims that they had created a pocket in Kucherev Yar and captured 50 Russian soldiers. Those videos published by Ukrainian sources are indeed online. Try to count 50 prisoners there yourself. I've watched and re-watched those clips. I only counted 6. And as I promised yesterday, I checked with the guys about what's really happening in Kucherev Yar, and here's what I learned. The soldiers say that it's a grey zone, meaning there are no Russian troops there, but there are no Ukrainian ones either. You can see that the northern part of Kucherev Yar is not under Russian control. That's where the footage with the Ukrainian flag was filmed, on the northern outskirts. Russian presence is occasionally observed in the southern part of the village. So, as the guys said, it's a grey zone. And of course, there were no 50 prisoners, not even close. 6 Russian soldiers were captured, and they will, of course, be returned during the next exchange. Now let's move on to the advances over the past day. And there were quite a few. The Russian army continues to improve its positions on the Orikhiv direction. In recent days, they have focused on this area specifically. If previously there had been no news from there for months, and the front line had been static, now for the 3rd day in a row, movement is being recorded. This time, Russian troops managed to expand their zone of control near the village of Novodanilivka. The fighters advanced by 1 kilometer and 900 meters and almost straightened the front line there. If they manage to move another 700 meters northward, the line will be completely straightened. A pocket is now forming between the highway and the village of Malotokmachka, and the immediate goal will likely be to link the Russian units here with those already operating in the center of Malotokmachka. At the same time, although the troops have captured nearly 30 square kilometers of territory in 3 days, this cannot yet be called a major breakthrough on the Orikhiv front. It's an improvement of positions, definitely, but not a decisive one. Remember, as I mentioned before, the front line here had not moved for years. In the area of Novoandriivka, there had been no progress for about 3 years. Near Novodanilivka, for more than 6 months. And yes, now the situation has changed noticeably. Over the past few days, about 30 square kilometers have been taken, but again, it's not a turning point. The real breakthrough will come when the Ukrainian forces are expelled from Novoandriivka, Novodanilivka, and Malotokmachka, and when the Russian army reaches the outskirts of Orikhiv. Then we can talk about a fundamental change, and the guys there are working on it. I'm sure they'll achieve success sooner or later. The initiative here clearly belongs to the Russian side. Let's move on. From the Dobropilya salient, there are also positive reports for the Russian army. Russian troops have entered the settlement of Shakov from the northwest. We're waiting for the full clearing of this settlement, as it's quite important. From this direction, it's convenient to advance both northward, westward, and northeastward, directly toward the rear of the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk grouping of the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian side understands this perfectly and keeps sending more and more reinforcements here. They've practically ignored other sectors, holding this one with their last remaining strength, sparing no reserves. Now, let's move to the Pokrovsk sector. Very good news came yesterday from the town of Rodinske, a small but strategically crucial settlement north of Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad. Despite its small size, it's a tough nut to crack, mostly consisting of multi-story apartment blocks. For a long time, the Ukrainian forces managed to hold the Russians at the outskirts, but it seems now they are starting to falter. Over the past 24 hours, Russian troops have taken full control of the territory south of the town along the railway and significantly improved their positions inside Rodinske itself, capturing Nova Street, Kotovskogo Street, and Osipenko Street. Moreover, as you can see on the map, they managed to reach Krasnolimanska Street, cross it, and seize a block of multi-story buildings on the western edge of the town. Now look at how the front configuration is forming. Rodinske is completely blocked from the east, and now also from the south and the north. Even in the west, the troops are beginning to advance. The current goal is essentially to repeat what Russian forces did in Kupiansk, to completely encircle the Ukrainian garrison in the city center. Fortunately, Rodinske is much smaller than Kupiansk, so the task is more manageable. I won't make firm predictions yet, but it's clear that the Ukrainian side here is beginning to collapse. It's quite possible that by the end of the autumn campaign, Rodinske will be fully under Russian control. And if that happens, the Russian army will be able to use it as a base to completely close the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad pocket, where several thousand Ukrainian soldiers are currently trapped. The catch could be substantial. Now, let's talk about the situation inside Pokrovsk itself. In the western part of the city, Russian troops began advancing along the highway toward the settlement of Hryshine, moving along the same supply route the Ukrainian army had used until recently. The Russians have advanced noticeably here, and the ring around the city continues to tighten. On the southern outskirts of the city, the Ukrainian army has essentially lost all its positions. The southern districts are now under Russian control, and Russian troops have reached the railway line, meaning that the majority of the city is already effectively under Russian control. Once Ukrainian logistics in these towns began to collapse, the front here started to move rapidly, and the Ukrainian army began slowly withdrawing its forces to avoid a disaster. Ukrainian sources have been calling the situation critical, but in reality it's already catastrophic. Most likely by the first days of December, this entire pocket will be fully cleared, and the front line here will advance significantly westward. Moving on, progress was also recorded on the Kostiantynivka front. Russian troops advanced 2.5 kilometers from Klyban Beek, circled the reservoir from the east, and linked up with their positions in Pleshivka. Now I'm particularly curious about what's happening south of the reservoir. The exit to the west is blocked, and now the east is also cut off. That's over 10 square kilometers of territory. And as you can see, it's not marked red on the maps, meaning there's no established Russian control there. It appears that once again, Ukrainian forces got caught in a blockade, unable to withdraw in time. Of course, they could try to cross to the other bank, but about 80 to 90% of them would die attempting it, since Russian drones fully control the area and any boat movement would be instantly targeted. Let's continue. For more than a week, there had been no changes on the Siversk direction, and now, finally, there are. Russian troops advanced 1 kilometer and 800 meters from Verkhnyo-Kamianske towards Siversk. Now, the distance from their positions to the city is less than 3 kilometers. However, we shouldn't expect an immediate assault. The groundwork isn't ready yet. The storming will begin only after Zvanivka in the south and Dronivka in the north are captured, and once the troops reach the highway. Then we'll see the battle for Siversk begin. And right before I started recording this video, new reports came in. Dronivka has reportedly come under Russian control. This means the Ukrainian front here is also collapsing, and the faster it falls, the more visible it becomes. It's no surprise that Zelensky now wants to freeze the conflict along the current front line. A pause would certainly benefit the Ukrainian side. And of course, Russian command understands this perfectly well. Let's move on to yet another sector where Ukrainian forces are consistently losing ground, the Lyman direction. Here, Russian troops advanced in two areas. The first one, south of Zareshny, saw progress through a forested area for more than 2.5 kilometers toward Lyman. A section of over 6 square kilometers came under Russian control. From these new positions, it's only 5 kilometers to the city itself. Moreover, Russian reconnaissance and sabotage groups have already twice reached the outskirts of Lyman directly. This is exactly why Ukrainian military analysts have gone into a real panic. The current Russian advance affects not only Lyman, but also Yampil. Fighting is already taking place on the approaches to the Moldova railway station. Once that area is cleared, the next step will be the complete sweep of the surrounding forest belt, and a push toward the central part of Yampil. In addition, progress was also achieved north of Lyman. As you can see, fighting there is already taking place on the approaches to the last Ukrainian line of defense, specifically in the village of Stavki. Russian forces advanced 900 meters. Russian soldiers even entered the village itself, but were unable to secure a foothold and therefore pulled back beyond the crossroads. It's obvious, however, that this was not the last attempt, and it's equally obvious that the Russian army will eventually take the village. Once that happens, the path toward Lyman North will be completely open. So, as you can see, total victories for the Ukrainian forces everywhere, right? At least that's what Zelensky believes when he claims that Russia is losing on the battlefield. Yes, of course. But seriously, over the past 24 hours, Ukraine has lost another 16.5 square kilometers of territory, which have come under Russian control. That's all for the frontline situation. Now let's turn to politics. Trump made a series of statements. There is no time frame for the end of the war, and Ukraine uses only European missiles for strikes deep inside Russia. He said, "I have no deadlines, no limits for when the war should end." It's hard to have deadlines in a war, you know? War means many things are happening. Ukraine doesn't use our missiles, they use European ones. I don't control that. I control our missiles, and we're not launching them. We have the most nuclear weapons in the world. Russia is second, China is third, far behind, but in 4 to 5 years, they'll catch up. Let's make a correction. In reality, it's generally accepted that Russia possesses the largest nuclear arsenal. Trump further stated that he supports Putin's idea of de-escalation in the nuclear sphere. He said that Ukraine and Russia need to fix their current frontline positions and cease hostilities. I hope Putin will act reasonably, and I hope Zelensky will too. It takes two to tango. Every time I speak with Vladimir, we have good conversations, but they lead nowhere, Trump said about Putin. I cancelled my meeting with Putin. We'll hold it in the future. It seemed we wouldn't reach the desired outcome, but we'll meet again. Talks on the war in Ukraine are going fairly well. I felt it was time to impose sanctions on Russia. We've waited long enough. At the same time, the US president expressed hope that the new anti-Russian sanctions wouldn't last long. Trump also commented on the Tomahawks. It takes at least 6 months to learn how to use Tomahawks, the only way we'd use them, and we're not going to. The stakes in this geopolitical game are rising, meaning the Ukrainian crisis is entering its most intense phase. Donald Trump announced that the US Treasury is introducing sanctions against Russia's largest oil companies, claiming that Russia doesn't want to end the war. We don't think new sanctions will help end the war. We think they'll only escalate the conflict, reports the Telegram channel Legitimate. The bargaining continues. I think we've all grown accustomed to the daily contradictory statements from the United States about the Ukrainian crisis. Therefore, the latest statement from US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, that President Trump is disappointed with the current state of peace talks on Ukraine, that the US will impose sanctions and calls on the G7, Europe, Canada, and Australia to join Washington in tightening sanctions against Russia, is simply part of the public bargaining process. So Trump has washed his hands of it and left the Russian armed forces in Kyiv to fight it out until one side imposes its own terms. Then he will return, in quotes, as the peacemaker who supposedly reconciled everyone. Meanwhile, judging by the latest strikes on Ukraine's rear areas, there seem to be no longer any restrictions on the list of targets being hit. This means that massive energy outages and blackouts in autumn and winter are a very real scenario. And this is not about trying to provoke popular unrest against the Kyiv regime. No. The goal is to cause the Ukrainian military-industrial complex to start failing seriously, and to make strategic railway logistics not impossible but as difficult as possible. Thus, strikes on the energy grid, traction substations, and locomotives will continue, and will expand in both scale and consequences. The United States is imposing sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft. The new sanctions also extend to 34 subsidiary companies of both Rosneft and Lukoil. Any legal entities in which Rosneft or Lukoil own 50% or more, directly or indirectly, are also subject to asset freezes under Executive Order No. 1/4024, even if they are not explicitly listed in the OFAC sanctions list. The United States is calling on Moscow to immediately cease fire and begin real negotiations to end the Ukrainian crisis. Washington also calls on the European Union, the G7, Canada, and Australia to join the sanctions against Russia. US citizens assisting in evading sanctions will face criminal prosecution. The ultimate goal of the sanctions is not to punish, but to achieve positive changes in behavior, the US Treasury stated. Foreign organizations working with Russia's energy sector or the mentioned companies risk facing secondary sanctions, according to the communiqué. I cancelled my meeting with Putin. We'll hold it in the future, Trump reiterated. Finita la commedia. Kirill Dmitriev commented on this. The key takeaway from the Alaska summit is that Donald Trump is focused on achieving a real peace agreement that would end the war, not just a ceasefire, which often doesn't last. All talks with Putin are conducted in a friendly tone, but they lead nowhere. I felt the time had come. We've waited long enough, Trump said regarding the sanctions imposed on Russia.